right. Hello. We're joined by another wonderful guest today. So we're just going to go around and introduce ourselves. My name is Dan Gerstein. I'm one of the co-founders of Pistol Shrimp. I worked for many years at Toys for Bob with Fred and Paul, and now we are all joined together working on Freestars Children of Infinity, the sequel to the Ur-Quan Masters.
I'm Fred Ford. Given that this is yet another interview, and I worked on the copyrighted work Ur-Quan Masters, which first was expressed in 1992, and since was released on its own merits in 2002. And I've worked on many other things, but the Ur-Quan Masters is what we're here for today.
I'm Chris Remo. I'm a game designer, writer, and composer. Worked on a number of games over the years, including Firewatch and Half-Life Alyx and The Cave and various other things. That's who I am.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.
Well,
Absolutely.
speaking of the moment or the game in question, how about the Ur-Quan Masters? So like how did you find this game? What was your experience of it like?
I remember being introduced to the first game in this lineage by a friend of mine in elementary school, and I honestly don't know how he obtained it. And we would play it alone and against each other, and I wasn't allowed to have video games or anything like that growing up. It just wasn't something in our household. So I remember when my mom, who worked in a sort of local real estate office, she brought a PC home with her from the office so that in her off hours she could learn how to use Lotus 123 spreadsheets and word processing and things like that. I remember installing things onto DOS, because obviously to me that was the only entertaining element of a computer at that age. And so I just remember sort of encountering this, I don't know, this sort of artifact that it was just such a sort of fascinating entertaining thing that kind of just came out of nowhere in my life. But it was one of the very first like proper kind of game experiences I can remember having in my life.
Was that kind of contemporary to when the games were released? Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been within the first probably year or two of that. It would have probably been 1993. So yeah, that would have been the year, based on my age and what grade I was in. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I mean, at that age, I definitely think of like formative game memories and how I relate to some of those things. How was it? What was your feeling with it? Aside from like, this is it, I'm actually curious about, you weren't allowed to have games in the house, but yeah, what was your
that kind of
relationship?
It was just that kind of household, not very much TV, it was just that sort of thing. I think the thing I remember finding really evocative about it was that, I'm going to misquote this, sorry, but it was something like, from the journals of the Ur-Quan Masters, there was some sort of slogan or subtitle or something when you loaded up the game.
Famous battles of the
Ur-Quan
hierarchy.
conflict or hierarchy, something like that. Yeah, and I remember really potently finding that incredibly evocative. Because I didn't, especially in that era before, the internet technically existed, but it certainly wasn't part of my life at that time, in that year. And when it wasn't possible to simply instantly look anything up and immediately find out its provenance and when it was created and so on, I just there were all these different races and these worlds, and that line suggested some sort of complex lineage. And it felt like, that's why I think one reason I referred to it as an artifact earlier, it felt like a kind of window into some kind of larger saga or kind of body of work that was whose size was indefinite and unknown to me. But I remember feeling, oh well, there's all of this detail. I mean, there's all of this, I remember there was sort of little blurbs about the different kind of races and ships and things, and I just remember thinking like, wow, this is almost like a snapshot or something of something much huger. And then I remember, the next game really sort of paid that off much more considerably and sort of like reinforced that sensation. But I remember thinking oh, I wonder what, I didn't even know it was the first one of anything. I mean, to me, it was this just kind of ambiguous kind of slice of some grand, tapestry. And I just remember finding that very, very kind of evocative.
Yeah, we kind of took a page out of Star Wars with
Totally. Yeah.
starting on the fourth volume. Uh,
Yeah, and I that honestly, actually, what's funny is that I had not experienced Star Wars at that time yet. I didn't. I think it probably would have been, I don't know, somewhere between 2 and 4 years later that I actually saw Star Wars for the first time again, just because that sort of environment I was in, I suppose. So that was kind of my first exposure to that particular way of sort of seeding or establishing a kind of science fiction, I don't know, mythos, I guess. So yeah, it made a big impact on me and really stuck in my memory.
you did tell your parents that it's not a game. I'm saving the universe.
Yeah, exactly, right. I think I didn't tell them anything. I
Okay.
think that's more accurate to what occurred. Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, the trick I learned was how to figure out how to switch programs really quickly so that you could say you were using the
Oh
computer
yeah,
for work, and then
right.
anytime anybody you could hear the door creak, it's like, bam, oh yeah, I
Well,
was
I
totally
mean,
working.
I really do remember at the time, I mean, really along those lines, there was this phenomenon of the boss key. Sort of, I think Sierra Online in particular would implement this kind of very tongue-in-cheek feature where you'd press escape and it would bring up a kind of full screen spreadsheet and I remember finding that hilarious. And I don't think it would have been very convincing at my age, but I remember finding that just a very kind of funny gag.
Yes, I
But
played.
it was totally a thing at that time.
Oh, it was. Yes, I think there were Ambrosia shareware games I played on the Mac, including my first like big sci-fi game was Escape Velocity, and I remember playing that on
Oh
the
yeah,
Mac.
Escape Velocity. Yeah, classic.
Yeah, and I definitely remember the boss key that would bring up a fake spreadsheet, and I was so confused as a kid, like, what is this for? I don't understand it.
Yeah,
Older
absolutely.
me
Very,
understood.
very different, currently outdated usage of boss when it comes to video game terminology.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, I can win the game? So if that was sort of your beginning, how did you wind up, excuse me, wind up working on games? What was your entry
Yeah, it's
into it?
very odd. It's very arbitrary in a way. Ironically, I think when I was growing up, it's not games weren't even necessarily my kind of first and foremost interest. Really, I played in bands as a teenager and things like that, and I really thought, well, I'm going to be a rock star, and that's going to be my job. I'm going to go into music, and I ended up studying music at university. That was my major. But there's this funny irony, which is that uh, because of the environment I was in school, uh, I was interested in all sorts of different things like film and music and games and so on. But games was the one where, because of the environment I was in, I didn't have anyone to talk about games with. So that was the thing that I sought out on the internet. It was discussing video games and finding other people who are interested in that to kind of fulfill discussion and interest that wasn't served in my real life, so to speak. And it was through that I ended up meeting a number of people who I went on to work with for many years, first in non-professional and then eventually most of them at one time or another in professional contexts. Now all of those people either work in the video game industry or have worked in it and have moved on to other things. But most of them are still there, and some of them are still kind of active colleagues of mine. So it really was finding a community at a particular, when I was at an age that was conducive to kind of making really early, I guess, creative relationships and partnerships at a time and an age when there weren't any stakes, but then eventually, as some of us moved into the professional world, those started becoming kind of incipient actual professional connections and not just sort of fun ones. So it was really kind of arbitrary. I spent a couple of years as a video game journalist when I was in my final year of university, and then for a couple of years after that before I ended up moving into video game development. But yeah, it was a very inadvertent thing, to be totally honest. And because I didn't come to it with any particular specific education around the things that go into game development. I ended up doing a number of different things, which is why I'm kind of a somewhat jack of all trades, master of none sort of game developer. But it's worked well with my personality, which is just, I really like being interested in a very wide range of things and sort of learning new skills and trying different things. And it's also helpful as a game designer, I think, just to have awareness of how many different disciplines work, because they all really ultimately contribute to game design. So yeah, it was an odd path I had into video game development.
No, is there a rock star inside still awaiting his turn?
Well, it's funny. I mean, probably not, I would say, at my age, but it has been nice to have made a few game soundtracks. It's never been my sort of primary occupation, but I have made a few game soundtracks, and some of them I've been fortunate enough to acquire the individual rights to. So, I have a Spotify, Spotify presence, and I do earn income from royalties on music. So in some kind of odd way, I've ended up kind of looping around to part of my living coming through my music, which has been surprising and in a very different form than I would have imagined it when I was 17 or whatever.
That's cool. So sideways route into game development, sideways route into Rockstar. I mean, who knows what's next? What are your other aspirations? The next things around the bend.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, that's really cool. You brought up sort of being like multidisciplinary, as sort of a useful trait. And I'll spare you the story, but I also fell into game development. I didn't try into game development.
Right.
And, games were more interesting than school, and I made friends playing games and all of that, just so I did what was fun. But, something I would go talk to the high school I went to, and they would have career days, and it was very weird to have the career day, and everybody says, go to this school. And I say, drop out of school, don't go to school, leave education. But, I joke, but seriously, for you, when you think about gosh, how did I learn all these things? What, especially I don't know, I have plenty of imposter syndrome, but what's your relationship having, just sort of fallen into it? So I'm well, I guess I'm doing this now. I guess I'm figuring this out as I go. What's your relationship with that? On the job, or especially working with other teammates, and you're hi, I'm the person who's here now, how do you have a personal relationship with that?
I mean, it's a good question. And I would say that it's varied over time. I mean, I think there are certainly times where I feel, because I've been fortunate to work with some incredibly talented people. I mean, I've worked with some people who are absolutely, genuinely world-class at their particular disciplines, just unbelievable artists. And I'm sure you've all had the same experience. And there are times where I think, wow, if I had really, from the age of just, 14 or whatever, really focused on a particular discipline, I just imagine, wow, I could be incredible, like this friend of mine who I really admire. So I certainly have that kind of insecurity and self-doubt at times, being a kind of sort of intermediate skill level at a number of things. But I think realistically, my personality is so omnivorously kind of interested in things. I think this is probably somehow the kind of appropriate path for me to have taken, but there are times where I do wrestle with it. I think it works better for some disciplines than others. I think game design is such a wide-ranging field, and over the years I've certainly become a lot more acquainted with programming to an extent that is useful. I mean, you'd never hired me as a software engineer, but I can typically find my way around the development environment of whatever game in question. I mean, working at Valve and things like Half-Life Alyx, I had to become to start learning how to write in C++ for the Source 2 engine, and that was certainly that was the most ambitious I had to ever become in terms of my programming chops, having not come from that world. But it's fun, it's fun to feel like I can sort of grow into those needs, as required, even if I'm never going to be a kind of top shelf programmer or whatever, whatever subdiscipline you might choose to name. And on Firewatch, I'd written game soundtracks before, but in addition to game design and music and story, I did all of the sound design and sound implementation for that. So it was okay, time to learn WWise and Foley and sound design and how to mix this stuff in an interactive environment. And again, you wouldn't hire me to be a dedicated sound designer, but I was really, I was proud of myself for being able to figure that out, on a small indie team and do it to the extent that was necessary to kind of do right by the game. So I think it's definitely been the source of insecurity and self-doubt at times, but also it's been fun, and it's been kind of a privilege to work on as many different parts of the creative process as I've been able to over the years. So yeah, it's my relationship with that is complex, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I wasn't trying to put words in your mouth. I was sort of
no,
prompting,
not
I
at all,
think,
not at all. It was a good question. Yeah.
I still have self-doubt, and I did concentrate on pretty much a single thing. So maybe it's just personality.
That probably comes with being in a creative field, perhaps in general. I mean, it's a strange thing to do with one's life, because there isn't an obvious kind of I mean, obviously there's sales figures and things, but that's so in some ways arbitrary, but there isn't an obvious measuring stick of, how well am I doing at this? It's so vague and amorphous and difficult to objectively judge. So yeah, it's probably comes with the territory. And as you say, I'm sure a lot of it's personality as well.
Yeah, well, but it's true. You can't, there's no gold medal. There's no time tracking. I mean, you have to go into like speed running if you want to start getting into like game ranking, like in a very objective way or something.
Yeah.
But I can relate to that a lot. The thing, I guess I try to remind myself of pride isn't or an emotion. I have a feeling I have a strong relationship with it, but
Right.
internally, saying just what you said resonates with me very strongly, which is I'm proud that I want to learn things. And, like as I get older, I've changed, and, my appetite for different things, maybe I get a little more narrow on certain, well, I'm less interested in this, more interested in that. And I find focus more, but, I think it is a strength, and I have to remind myself that it is a strength to want to learn to do something. And it is a strength to approach something and say, I don't know how to do this, but that's okay. And even the things that I think I know how to do, I'm like, there's still a part of me that I'm really not sure how this is going to go. But, that's what we call iteration. And I think iteration, it helps games. It helps us, maybe. I don't know. Having an open mind.
For sure. I mean, being willing to ask questions and acknowledge that you don't know things is so important. I mean, I remember working at Double Fine, and Double Fine did this great, I think they still do, this great thing called Amnesia Fortnight, which is in between major game projects, spend 2 weeks splitting the whole company up into teams, and then making, each team will sort of come up with a prototype. Well, individual people at the company will pitch prototypes. The winning ones will then be put in charge of a team within the company. And then you spend 2 weeks, prototyping the game. And that was the first time I ever wrote code for a game, because it was a totally low stakes environment. But there were a couple programmers at Double Fine, Anna Kipnis and Paul Dubois, who were so generous with me, saying, okay, here, try and write a simple system to play that, to implement the sound for this game or whatever. And I just remember being willing to kind of just humbly acknowledge, look, I don't know what I'm doing, but I would love to learn enough of this to be helpful. And their incredible generosity and patience with me to just, gave me just enough to get to the point where I could think, okay, now I can start learning more of this on my own. But it was absolutely invaluable to have, an incredibly professional and adept person to kind of point me in the right direction. And because it's so easy to feel like, you're just totally out of your depth, or you're, an idiot compared to these brilliant people around you. So being willing to acknowledge you don't know things and ask questions, I've found to be pretty critical in my career.
Yeah, we solve that by not being brilliant, so that everybody who comes to work with us just, immediately feels okay, I can hang out with these folks.
And as we learn things, we point people in the wrong direction. So that,
right, there you go. Keep mixing it up.
Yeah. No, but it's like, seriously, having, brought on, hired, mentored, whatever, trying to teach different things. Like one of the most difficult things, and I don't know if it's maybe as you're calling it, it's personality, I don't know, but is like, hey, it's okay to be wrong. Encouraging people to like try something, to have it not be right, and that you don't have to stick the landing your first try. And the joke, this ain't my first rodeo, this is like my 100th rodeo, and I still don't think I'm gonna stick the landing. So sort of a healthy attitude towards rodeos, but also game development. But so pivoting a little bit, just because you were talking about like, oh, games that you played when you were young, like, do you draw influences like as you're working on things, and especially just what you brought up about like that phrase conveying, sorry, it's bird time here, that phrase conveying, like, oh, there's a bigger universe. Like for you, what, like if you're trying to create a universe, which in the games you've worked on, I think did successfully. And so like when you're trying to imply things, especially outside the box of the game, and that there is a universe, how, here you go, you can give the consulting fee later or whatever, but how do you go about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to give a sort of one size fits all answer to that, but I mean, I think there are certainly circumstances in which this is more or less true. This isn't necessarily equally true for every game or even every genre or anything like that. But I do often think of writing for games as almost more comparable to like, I don't know, sort of like environmental art than it is to screenwriting in the sort of filmic sense. It's less about a sort of script in which things are kind of linearly conveyed, and more about things that help sort of feed into the overall game design and the overall world creation. So, writing in games is often sort of atomic units that are relevant to some particular part of a game world, or the response to player exploration, or the response to player interaction. I mean, these are sort of categories of things that don't exist in very many other forms of writing, and they should relate, to the overall kind of tapestry of words in the game, but not in the same sense that a sort of discrete scene does in a film or something, where that will always come after the preceding scene and will always come before the succeeding scene. I mean, creating a kind of world in a game is the writing and the art and the sound and the music and everything all just sort of working together. I mean, it's hard to say this is how you do it, because obviously it's the work of many people working together. It isn't really one person who says, I'm going to create a world in a video game. I mean, even if you have the impetus to do so, it's only going to have meaning as a totality of all of these different disciplines working together. But I think the important thing is maintaining tone. I think tone is it's just so important in video games, and I think it's easy in games for it to kind of get out of control, because there is so much creation that goes into even a very simple video game. There's just so many assets and things, and just there's everything all over the place. It's very easy for it to get out of sync without even really noticing. So I think I think honestly the biggest thing to creating tone is just maintaining the biggest thing to creating a world is maintaining tone and consistency. I mean, that just goes so far. I mean, those things I was mentioning, that sort of line of the famous battles of the Ur-Quan conflict or whatever, like that sets a tone immediately, and there's almost a sense of kind of the mythic in a sense with something like that, and then also kind of references of things that have happened long in the past, like that ties into that same kind of tone that was teed up right at the beginning. So just sort of I don't know, just all the different bits that have to go into the game. Obviously, it's never going to be literally every single asset in the entire game is exactly pointing in one direction, but within reason, trying to think what is the overall kind of emotional direction of this thing, and are the different disciplines basically moving in that direction. I just think it's so important, because the sensation of walking around a world in a game, or existing in a world, or even just navigating menus can be such, can have such a significant effect on the mental state of the person playing. And again, that's just different than how a lot of other creative media works. So yeah, I think it's not confusing what the world is with other things. I mean, sometimes you'll be playing a game and it'll have really incredibly evocative environmental design and it'll be, really beautiful, but then you'll have like weird menus with a bunch of plus things like coming in all over the top of it, and it'll feel like a skateboarding game or something, and you're like, well, that's really out of character with the, what else is tonally going on in this thing. Whereas in a really intricate science fiction world where there's lots of kind of technology, you can have a lot of the same really intricate systems with plus and minus numbers and things, and it actually fits into the tone. I mean, there's just different, there isn't like a one way to do it, but I think it's so important to be thinking of all the different parts of the game as kind of pointing towards something that the players ultimately can experience, and not acting like some of it just doesn't really matter, because it all still goes into their eyes and their brain and their ears and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty insightful. And also it's like, to your point of comparing it to like film writing, right? We have so many more tools at our disposal. And, as a player, sometimes I'll play games and I go, oh, it's so disappointing that they didn't use all the tools. I see what's trying to be done, or it succeeded here, but then this part, like UI is a great example of something that gets forgotten sometimes. And, oh, well, this, they didn't have, but I also understand, having worked on all the games, oh, we didn't have budget, we didn't have time, we didn't have, there's so many, who knows the story behind it, but I can definitely see this part got, this part stayed here and then other parts may have fallen by the wayside. And so I don't presume to know anything that happened during game development other than having all my own war stories, I guess, of seeing things that happen and things that need to come together. But, I really like that answer. Thinking of it as environment art, I mean, maybe that's an answer that only makes sense to other game developers, but that's like a really powerful statement to me, and it makes a lot of sense. Something I've been
I mean, it's
coming
certainly
back
not
to.
an idea I would have had without having been a game developer. I wouldn't have thought of things that way, I think, just as a player. But I mean, maybe there are players who do, but yeah, for me, that came out of working on a number of games.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, the thing I like about extending the environment art metaphor is another word that's just been in my head lately when I think about what is it that's going to add coherency to something, especially like the Ur-Quan Masters, which is very much a like some of its parts game. There's a lot of like very different aliens that almost don't even exist in the same universe, artistically, writing style. There's a lot of things that they have a lot of freedom in a lot of ways. And something that makes a game feel really coherent, and a universe especially feel coherent to me, is recollection. I've been really obsessed with that word lately. And it's the idea that the game remembers something, the game, and the feeling that the game knows more than you do. And sure, it's letting on its secrets over time. You're learning it as you play through the game or experience its media, especially with games that like have marketing campaigns and things, all the way up to like ARGs and things like that. But recollection is so powerful. I mean, it works in film, right? You can have a flashback an hour into the movie and go, oh, remember that, and help you remind you of something. But that's a ham-fisted simple example, but games' ability to recall things are interactive, and so the game can remember something you did, and you may have forgotten you did it. It's like, oh, this happened 5 hours ago in the game, but here we are now. And for me, like as a player and as a creator, when I think about like how can I most powerfully, and in a way only games can do, give you something that makes you feel like, whoa, this is really happening. And recollection has been like a word I've been really attached to lately, and only games can do that, and in a like tailor to the player way. No, every other media is going to be the same every time.
No, absolutely. I strongly agree with that. I mean, that's something that I remember working on Firewatch. That was incredibly important to us because we were sort of working in a genre that had a reputation. People refer to things like walking simulators and have a reputation for being very linear, very kind of predetermined. And it was really, really important to us that the game be, the term that I used was reactivity. So, but I think it's basically the same concept you're describing, which is that the game, theoretically, anything the player does can be known by the game and reacted to at some point, either immediately or later. And the player, obviously it's not going to apply to literally every single thing the player ever does, but from the player's standpoint, it should feel like anything can be. I mean, you pick this thing up rather than that thing, or you find this path rather than that path. That could have an effect an hour later, 2 hours later, or in an immediate conversation, because the world should feel alive, and it should feel like your presence in it actually matters, even if in our case, the overarching story was, the big events are linear, but the player's path through it need not be. And yeah, I mean, certainly the Ur-Quan Masters, I mean, that was this like sense of, I remember it feeling just almost overwhelming in terms of kind of all the different things that were clearly speaking to one another, and the variables bouncing up against each other, and just feeling like, wow, I mean, there's like a sort of grand strategy sensation that just feels almost like all encompassing. I remember feeling the first time I played that, like, I'm not old enough for this, not in the sense of like not wanting to play it, but just feeling like, wow, this is something that's almost asking me to sort of rise to it in a way. Which is a
That was
sensation I
very
remember.
intentional. Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah. So could you comment on that a bit?
Well, we were very conscious of the player arc, and we wanted you to feel weak and helpless and overwhelmed at the
Yeah.
beginning, not to the point where you would just give up,
Sure.
but then we wanted you through your journey to get strong and powerful, and the things that were thwarting you at the beginning, we wanted to be easy to conquer at the end, so that you actually felt like you made a journey from weak and powerless to strong and yeah, commanding.
That's such an amazing thing to hear, because I feel like that arc is such a sort of common target in kind of video game stories, but usually just through the kind of story that's depicted, as opposed to the story the player actually experiences through their actions specifically. I mean, there's kind of the hero's journey, or the sort of arc of like depicting a character getting more powerful, but the actual sensation of feeling that is, I think, much harder to achieve, and much more kind of rarely actually depicted in games. And you almost need there are almost certain kinds of games where that wouldn't even be reasonable to attempt. You almost need a sufficient amount of complexity for that to even be a realistic target. And to be totally honest, I've not really had the opportunity to work on the kinds of games that would allow that to be achieved through the kind of genuine gameplay experience. So I have to imagine that must be a really kind of satisfying thing to create and then see actually work on people.
Yeah, it is, and it was, and we didn't really know whether or not it would work, especially because the story could be experienced in a non-linear fashion, and
Yeah,
we couldn't
absolutely.
control what the player was going to do. I mean, we did to some extent. There were kind of chapters in the game which wouldn't become available until you had achieved certain things in the previous chapter. But other than that, we let you go wherever you wanted to go.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an amazing thing to bite off. I mean, I guess I can't. It's hard for me, honestly, even to imagine what it would have been like to release a thing of that scope and then not get immediate reactions and feedback to it, just because of the reality of what the world was at the time.
Yeah, yeah, it was odd, but it sucked so much out of us. I mean, it
Oh
sucked
God, yeah,
a lot of love too, and
yeah,
we really wanted to make that game, and we made it the way we wanted to make it, but we were exhausted by it,
I
and
bet.
happy for a palate cleanse at that point.
I'm sure. I can imagine.
Sorry, if I get off camera, it's because I'm wrestling birds, like, literally.
I saw that there was a bird on this
yeah,
in your life. Yeah.
they want to talk to you. It's you should be flattered, I guess. But so when you said you haven't been able to work on something like that, would you want to work on that if you got the opportunity to?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been what I've focused on in my career just because of the kind of way that things have fallen. I I mean, I absolutely would work on such a thing. If the opportunity came along and it was the right thing. Yeah, it's funny. You asking me makes me realize I haven't really considered sort of putting myself in that position. I think because I guess because it just so happened that the things I started out on, the first studio I worked at was Irrational, working on the BioShock series, and then after that, Double Fine, which um, makes very kind of narrative-driven games. So the first thing I worked on that kind of had my name on it in a sense was I co-wrote The Cave with Ron Gilbert, which was exciting for me because that was a person who made the other kind of side of games that I was playing at right at the same time. That yeah, that was an amazing honor to work with him as a co-writer. But because of that, I kind of settled into really focusing on game design as it relates to narrative design and games that have that kind of particular attitude towards centering the player in a narrative. And I guess it's funny. I just never really ended up in the situation to work on something that has that kind of grand gameplay scope. But yeah, it'd be fun. I mean, I guess the closest thing was at Double Fine. I worked on a game called Space Base DF9, which was a kind of space base builder / life sim. And it was really fun to get to poke at some of the kind of social sim systems that governed these little characters running around and touch those systems and think about that, because I do think a thing that made me realize was thinking about game design in any context. It's not that you'd necessarily be equally good at designing any kind of game, but thinking about interactive systems and how they intersect with the player, it does translate more than I would have expected across genres, because so much of it is about just imagining how the things you're designing are going to bump up against a kind of like naive player's brain. I don't mean naive in a like pejorative sense. I just mean, the brain of somebody who wasn't involved in making up the stuff, so they have no preconceptions about it. And so much of what you do as a game designer is kind of like train yourself to constantly be imagining things from a variety of different player perspectives. And I did kind of find working on something like that, which is very different to the other sorts of things I'd worked on, that it does kind of translate. I'm not saying I'm a brilliant designer of that sort of thing by any means, but yeah, I think I would enjoy working on something of grander scope and just seeing like, how does my experience translate to this? I think that'd be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with you that it is a translatable skill. I mean, the joke, we used to do development streams, and the joke I would always say is I'm not the story guy. And that's really nice because it just lets me off the hook for anything. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to pull something out of thin air and say it. Like, what's the explanation for the ship? Why is it there? I'm like, I don't know. I don't really care. I'm thinking, is it fun to have my hands on the keyboard and shoot missiles and whatever?
Sure.
It's like, but the mental state, what you're talking about is, well, how do I imagine someone experiencing this? Or how are they going to relate to the sound, the art, the story behind it, the fiction, whatever, all of it? It is kind of the same thing, which is you're trying to communicate something with the player and you want them. I mean, actually, for me, Skylanders was a very regardless of how it performed and what people remember it as, the actual interaction, having a physical object that you interact with is kind of like, it's kind of how all games feel to me, is like, oh, I get to interact with something. What are the ways I can interact with it? How does that feel? What does it feel good to do this? Do I want the player to feel unhappy when things happen? Am I trying to frustrate them? All of those things seem to translate. The thing that for me is like really impressive when I look at narrative things, and because that is seriously the side of design I have never, ever touched. And I've done everything else.
Sure.
I'm a terrible level designer. I did learn that much, but I've never touched like narrative things. Long before I was working on, this project, I was thinking about, I want to do an alien dating simulator, because that would be the like real, maybe again, it's personality. I like learning things. I'm just like, how would I approach like more narrative things? How would I approach something that's a little more social, or like writing oriented. And I seriously thought, in dating sims were still kind of just starting to take off when I was thinking about this. I think I'd played like one of the old Persona games, and gosh, this game would be so fun. But I don't like that they're all humans, I think it would be fun to date some other creatures or whatever. So yeah, alien dating sim lived in my head for a long time. I never got to do it. I was too busy.
Maybe someday.
But someday, yeah. Or maybe we're going to wind up in this game somehow. I mean,
Yeah,
now
there you go.
look,
There
it's
you
gotten popular in the marketplace. Like, dating
true.
in Baldur's Gate 3, people love it.
It's true. It's kind of finding its way into many genres at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, on that note too, like genre, that's something Fred, you would talk about too, with like Ur-Quan Masters, how there was no genre. So I'm just kind of curious what actually all of us think, like, what is it like having all of these genres? Even, yes, like somewhat, I don't think it's a derogatory term, walking sim. I've played so many good walking sims, so to me, it's not a bad word, but I get how it sounds like a poo-pooing of it. But like, what's it like, especially Fred, because you've been doing this so long, like, hey, there weren't genres, now there are. What's the relationship with that as a creator?
Yeah, well, during these calls, people often ask, how did you know what you were making? And I said, well, back then, nobody knew what they were making because we were just making games. There was no blueprint to follow back then, really. The first person shooters hadn't really even happened yet because the computers weren't powerful enough. And so without genres, you're just left to like, hey, what would be fun? And there's no recipe for us to follow. So let's throw things against the refrigerator and see what sticks. And I think genres have, in some ways, they diminish creativity if people follow them, but it's nice to see so many indie games these days that are breaking out of them. But obviously, the super quadruple A titles have to follow a blueprint, or they'll spend $1 gazillion doing something that they're not sure will sell. I don't know. I don't know what your relationship has been with that.
I have not worked on. I have sort of intentionally, where possible, moved away from the kind of big AAA side of things. I mean, the most AAA thing I ever worked on was the first game I ever professionally worked on, BioShock Infinite. And since then, I guess the next biggest would be Half-Life Alyx, but that was like such a smaller team by comparison. It's almost comical, even though it was more than a decade later. So and most of the things I've worked on have been much smaller than that. So I haven't had to quite deal with that sort of huge pressure of fitting into a narrowly defined genre. But you can have almost the same problem, I think, at the other side of the scale, where you have, there's so little resources that you almost have to be doing something very, very targeted and very kind of, limited in scope, just because that's the reality. I think the reason, by the way, just that I said walking simulator and kind of referenced it in that way, is not because I would disparage games called that, or that I mean, I don't care really, what genre something is or not. It was more that with respect to genre, what we were trying to do was expand on some of the things that we thought had become de facto genre limitations for games like that, which is, most games that you could describe that way, all of the story has already happened in the past by the time the player shows up, which means it's essentially impossible for there to be kind of genuine reactivity to player action, because there isn't new content to happen. You're largely an archaeologist. You're exploring a world in which things have already occurred, and that's incredibly interesting, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But we really wanted to try and push those genre walls a bit and say, okay, well, what if there is a story that's happened, but also you find yourself in the middle of events that are occurring? Therefore, the way that you push against these events and the actions you take in the game and the way you interact with the mechanics legitimately affect the response of the world and the other character and and even your own character's kind of relationship to these events, not just purely in terms of the way the player thinks about it, but literally in the actual game systems and in the, in the environment. So that's the only reason I brought that up. But it's a good example, to Fred, what you were saying about kind of trying to, I mean, not even trying, but just, well, in your case, working without the genre kind of definitions to begin with. I think we were trying to sort of force ourselves into that place with respect to this genre of game and say, okay, well, if we weren't making something that, if we weren't in a world where the games of this kind of template or genre or whatever follow this very specific set of restrictions, how might we tell an interactive story in a game that brings in things we find interesting from other games, regardless of, so I mean, this is so bizarre, but one of our biggest influences on Firewatch was Far Cry 2, because not because our game had any guns or combat in it, which it didn't, but because that game had a really, I think, impressive attitude towards situating the player in a real-time environment. So when you bring your map up in that game, you're still 100% in the game. The game clock doesn't stop. It's not modal. The map is in the actual world. You can still run around. You can still get shot. It's, nothing stops when you bring up your map, even though it covers most of your screen. So it puts you in this very, I was thinking of this, Fred, when you mentioned almost intentionally disempowering the player in order to enable them to then kind of transcend that. And that's a thing I really love in games in general. I think it's so powerful when a game puts things in your way to then allow you to kind of rise above it over time and with your understanding of the systems in the world. And Far Cry 2 did that in a really kind of, I think, honest way. I mean, it was a tough game in a lot of respects, and it has its detractors, but I think it's sort of brilliant in the way that it tackles some of these issues. And so we brought some of that into Firewatch because we were kind of inspired by that attitude towards genuine player immersion, even though our game, like I say, it doesn't have guns and combat and all these things. I think it would be easy to say, because our game doesn't have guns and combat systems and all these things, therefore Far Cry 2 is irrelevant to it effectively. But I think one of the things about game design is that ideas come from everywhere. And the way, I mean, to Dan, what you were saying about the important thing is kind of, how does the player feel? How does the player react? If this game of a totally different genre has created in me a sensation that I would like to inspire in the players of our game, there's really no reason why we can't draw from that in ways that might be additive to our experience. And the difference is that we were still making, for various reasons, including kind of budgetary realities and also just the kind of priorities we had for communicating the sort of story we had, we were systemically working, an intentionally smaller pool than something like the Ur-Quan Masters, which kind of needs a certain systemic scope in order to pay off its ambitions. I remember we had all sorts of extra mechanics, like we had a sort of literal firefighting mechanic in the game, and where you'd actually use the firefighting mechanism and search fires on the horizon. And there were these kind of map triangulation systems that were inspired by this game called Miasmata and all these things. And we eventually realized, okay, this is a bit too far afield for what we're trying to do. And it's more likely to confuse the player than it is to kind of add to the experience. So, when kind of engaging in that sort of melange of genres, obviously, there's the other side of it is, well, don't overwhelm the player to such an extent that they're not even going to understand what your game is anymore. It's still, obviously it still has to cohere in a way that the player can basically comprehend.
Yeah, we threw out features in Ur-Quan Masters that we felt actually detracted from the game. And we had a whole landing party system where you compose your landing party of various aliens, and they would be better at diplomacy or whatever. And
yeah.
it just was a lot of bookkeeping,
like a Star Trek kind of thing almost.
Yeah, exactly. It was a lot of bookkeeping, and it just was much more fun and direct to have you land with the lander and drive around and shoot at things. And we also had kind of a fleet, ordering your fleet of escort ships around, like when you came into a solar system.
Mhm.
You could send your support ships to different planets to, I don't know whether we would have had them mine or what, but anyway, you could send them out and do things, and it just it became bookkeeping, and the player wasn't doing the fun stuff. And so we threw it out, and threw both of those things out. Um, that was months of development for two people,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
was not fun to throw out. But
Yeah.
It's
The lesson is
it's
throw
honestly
stuff out.
surreal. Well, no, that is an important lesson. Honestly, I feel like that's one of the most important skills for game designer to have, is realizing when something should be cut. I mean, I genuinely believe that really strongly. But sorry, I just have to say it's like incredibly surreal to hear you describe that, because I wasn't aware of that information, and it's just bizarre for me, like on a just a human level, to to just sort of be talking to the person who was making those decisions and then resulting in that game. It's kind of an amazing thing. But it reminds me of a sensation that I had when playing that game, which was one of the things I think that I found so fascinating and striking about it. Because again, for another game I really loved at that time was the original Civilization, so Civ 1. I played quite a lot. And I remember a thing that I found really striking about Ur-Quan Masters was the kind of simultaneous, like, I don't know, sort of ambition and kind of grand strategy and almost cerebral side of it, but also, you like point a spaceship around and shoot your guns at the other spaceship. And I remember just and because when you're describing the landing party and the decision you were making around that, it was an absolutely fascinating thing that I remember feeling, of like having all of those tonal elements of a sort of science fiction experience. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it in these, obviously at that age, I wasn't sort of conceptualizing this in these specific terms, but I can think back now to the emotional experience I had playing that game, and definitely that's what was going on, was in a way almost being sort of confused, like, oh, you can have both of these at the same time. Because I mean, even then, that wasn't a very common experience in computer games, but it is one of the things that I really love about, I mean, that game, but also the kind of world of PC games in that era. I mean, you were sort of touching on this earlier, Fred. Just it was such an amazing cauldron of sort of different genres and different game design ideas and exploration. I mean, it's extraordinary what was going on at the time in terms of people poking in different directions and just kind of inventing this stuff whole cloth. I mean, it was an amazing period to be experiencing game design.
Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of interesting games, and Ron Gilbert, all those guys at LucasArts
Oh yeah, Tim
did great
Schafer, yeah.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I know you said you had a hard stop, so I want to let you off the hook, Chris. But thank you so much for joining us and talking today. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
I did too. I mean, I'm sorry if this is a bit silly, but I mean, honestly, it's quite an honor for me, Fred, to chat with you and talk about this stuff and just hear some of those experiences, because yeah, it was a very sort of important kind of game design pillar in my life. So,
Well, thank you.
thanks.
And it was
Yeah.
nice to meet you too.
Yeah. All right. Cheers. Well, thank you so much to both of you, and Dan, great to meet you and talk to you as well. And thanks to both of you for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. We'll be in touch when we share this. Probably.